So we're on. This week, Ross Povey is with us from the Tudor Collector. For me, Ross needs no introduction. He's widely regarded as one of the oracles, really, for Tudor collectors, people into the military history of the Tudor brand. And Ross, in addition to that, also does an awful lot of writing for different publications and has them for a while. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ross Povey. Ross, welcome, mate.
Thank you for having me. It's very
pleasure.
Very kind of you to invite me on this.
I'm glad we could do it, mate. I always start conversations and I say, it's interesting, because I genuinely do find it interesting. But I think our paths crossed, mate, originally with a visit from one of our American friends.
Yep.
Over to our workshop. WOE came over. When was that? September, October? Then, I think September-ish last year. And I think a conversation had happened between you guys, and he managed to convince you to head over as well. Yeah. We sat down, we had a few coffees and a good chat, and I think he walked away from that with a Tudor Submariner, if that.
Yeah, we've walked away with one of my treasures.
Mate, I remember you coming in. I was actually telling my wife yesterday about that happening, and I think I kind of explained it where you were thrilled to bits to pass this on, but I could almost see like the apprehension. It was like giving like a child away.
Yeah, I mean, my wife would kill me for saying that, but they're like your kids or your like next level of things after your kids, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
absolutely. If you don't mind, mate, could you touch a little bit on that watch and tell us sort of the history and the background on that? Is that okay?
Absolutely, yes. So, I mean, Tudor military is one of my things that I'm very much into and have spent probably too much time in my life researching and getting my head around.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting military Tudors that are out there are the watches that were issued to the South African Special Forces divers.
Okay.
This was something that I picked up on probably 15 years ago. So everybody knows about Tudor MN watches. Yep. And that is sometimes a phrase that people use to refer to military Tudors, regardless of, what Navy or Army it was issued to. And so a Tudor MN in some ways has been kind of misused to represent any Tudor military watch. So the MN watches, MN stands for Marine Nationale, and they are the de facto military Tudors, I guess, in many people's minds. The blue snowflake on the grey NATO strap doesn't get a lot better than that. Yeah. And so I was aware of those watches. I thought they were fab. I've owned a number over the years. But the watches that really drew me in and kind of, in some ways, I guess maybe started this whole thing for me were the South African issued Milsobs. And to me, they were something a bit different. There were very, very, very few of them compared to maybe the hundreds of French issued watches that we know about. There are maybe, a dozen South African issued watches. What's interesting about them, or what became apparent over the years of my research, was the very, very, very small serial batches in which those watches were issued.
Okay.
So we know that those watches were issued in 3 distinct batches, and the first batch of those watches coincides with the first French issued watches that were engraved with the MN letters, which was in 1974. Okay. So the French Marine Nationale issued Tudors, the most well-known are the blue snowflakes. But the very first year that they engraved on the case back the MN and then the year number was 1974. So MN 74. Yeah. And those watches were actually black snowflake Tudors, reference 7016. And they belong to a very small serial batch that begins at 827. Yeah. So that's kind of how we understand what we refer to as the batches of the watches that were issued. Yeah. So 827 was used for the MN, and interestingly, that batch was also used for the South African watches. So they belong in the same serial range as the French watches. So this was the first thing that occurred to me. And then when I started looking through this more and more, it became apparent that there was possibly a link between the South African issued watches and the French issued watches.
Right.
So and I always try to avoid political conversations around these watches, because to me, the watches are what they are. You know, they don't represent necessarily the political times in which they were issued, although that is part of it. But at the time, there was an embargo around South Africa and supply of military goods to the South African Navy.
Yeah.
However, the French didn't sign up to that.
Okay.
So we know that the first submarine that was issued, the first submarine that was supplied to the South African Navy was by the French.
Right. Okay.
The French Navy diving school trained the South African divers.
Right.
So I have some poetic license in this, but what I believe happened was that the South African divers, when they were training in France, saw that the French divers were wearing the Tudor snowflake subs. Is it possible that those watches were ordered through the French Navy as part of that supply chain to South Africa? I think, yes, that is possible.
Yeah.
I've had lots of conversations, and I've got now a couple of friends or acquaintances who are ex-South African Special Forces divers who've helped me kind of piece all this together.
Yeah.
And so over the period of many years, I kind of started putting this together. And as part of that, some of the watches would cross my path. And I was lucky to acquire a couple of them over the years.
Yeah.
Like everything in life, you can't, or in the watch life, you can't keep everything.
Of course. Yeah.
And so a decision for me was made. I've got, a very nice blue South African, in fact, the only blue known South African Navy issued Tudor. And I just decided that it was probably time to move my original 827 batch watch on. But finding the custodian for it was important to me.
Yes, absolutely.
And so through an interesting chain of events, I ended up in contact with Mr. W.A.
Yep.
And we chatted for a while. We've got a good mutual friend, and it just seemed to be the right thing. He happened to be coming to the UK from the States within, I think, a week of us starting this conversation.
Yep.
For him, it was his Grail watch.
Of course.
I guess other than the unique blue one, not unique, but the only known blue one, I guess the top of the tree for the South African watches are the 827 batch because they're from the same 1974 batch as the MN.
Yeah.
For him, that was important.
Yes.
The history of that watch, it came directly from South Africa. There's a great story, which is a bit involved for now, but long story short, a friend of my brother's was working for the Lions rugby union team.
Okay.
And at the time, this was many, many years ago. Again, this watch has always had, for me, this magic of circumstances just being right. And I was in touch with the owner of this watch in South Africa, and he happened to live in one of the cities where the Lions tour was going. And so we struck a deal. Again, this was a long time ago. So it was all done via email. So it took a month backwards and forwards, getting up in the morning, checking your email. And so I gave the cash to my brother's friend, and he met this guy in a hotel in South Africa where he lived, and he brought it back for me. And I never forget, he came to my house to drop it off, and it was like super exciting for me. Wow. And that for me is a very, very important watch.
Yes. Yes.
And I think probably still now I would say that those black dialed early military Tudors are pretty cool.
You lit a fire in me, mate, when you came over and presented that watch to its new owner. And subsequently, I think I've texted you a few times of different things I've seen, and mate, it's. I've always said the watch chooses the man, not the other way around. And for me, I'm waiting for mine to appear from somewhere, and
it will.
And that day will happen, mate. And I can anticipate the excitement. But the history around those those watches just insane, absolutely insane. And it's almost sad in a way that it's only people getting into this or people uneducated in the broader scope of it.
Yeah.
Completely just refer to the MN stuff as the French stuff. There was a lot more that went on, that isn't as widely known. So this story around the South African stuff and the nuances and the things that had to happen and had to go right for number one, theoretically or potentially that diver to be going through his training in France to come back and then decide, right, okay, this is the correct tool for the job. We need to speak to the CEO or whoever's in charge of procurement about, setting up this conversation with Tudor, I'd assume, about getting these tools in for us. Then it living its life in the military to then, ultimately on a Lions tour, finding its, it's just awesome. Stories behind them are just awesome. And it's so interesting to hear that Tudor's had involvement with other countries. I mean, we've seen that recently with the SEALs.
Yep.
US Navy SEALs and the black dial that was done there. It's just, there's so much more going on, I think, behind that brand and its military touches than just the French stuff. As exciting as the French stuff is, I don't want to take anything away from that. No. But most people only know about the French stuff.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets, excuse me, really exciting. Talking about the French stuff, this is where essentially this kind of started for Tudor, I'd assume. So what was the process through your research, because I know you've dug into this quite a bit. What was the process that, where someone in the Marine Nationale decided, right, okay, we're going to start diving with Tudors? Do you know how that story went and what that time frame was?
Yeah, I mean, the important thing to always bear in mind with Tudor, and this isn't something that is not spoken about. They use this a lot in their communication as a brand.
Yeah.
So Tudor was envisaged by Hans Wilsdorf, founder of Rolex, to be a watch that had all the quality hallmarks of a Rolex, but at a more accessible price point.
Okay.
So if you think of military life, well, you're ex-military, the rough and tumble of equipment.
Yes.
And the high turnover and loss rate, damage rate.
Yeah.
Tudor was a great value proposition for the military because they were getting a watch that they knew had the quality of a Rolex, because Rolex has always been, I'm a Rolex and Tudor is my thing. People say you into watches. I say, well, I'm into Rolex and Tudors.
Yeah.
But I love watches. But I mean, that's my thing, really, those two brands. And honestly, for me, I think a lot of this was around the fact that they were getting quality Rolex watches, which everybody understands how great Rolex is, but at this accessible price point. So at that time, the cases, the winding crowns, the bezels, the crystal, everything was Rolex. Yeah. Just with a third-party movement.
Of course.
In effect, which is something that Tudor did up until they introduced their in-house movements a few years ago. So the opportunity for the forces to issue such great watches and not have to panic too much about the price of them made sense.
Yeah.
And so that led to the first batch being delivered to the French Navy in 1956.
Right, okay.
To a research department, the GERS. I'm not going to try and pronounce it in French.
No, I wouldn't ask you to, yeah.
But they were issued the first watches in 1956, a batch of 7922 Submariners, which were quite small 37 millimeter watches with very small winding crowns. Yeah. Proportionally, if you think about a modern date, just something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
Also, they also got some very strange, the only ever manual wind Submariner from Rolex or Tudor. Wow. Reference 7923. A very, very, very interesting watch. Because it didn't have the automatic movement, it was a very thin watch, which would have been great to wear on the wrist, I guess, in a lot of kind of situations. Yeah. So these watches were delivered in 56, and then I think the French Navy became like research and development partners for the brand. And so a lot of the feedback that came, I think, informed the changes in the watches. So one of the issues with these early watches, the 7922, was the size of the winding crown, which led ultimately, and they were, I think, waterproof to 100 meters. So then in 1958, 2 years later, Tudor delivered the big crown, the daddy of Submariners, the 7924 in 1958. There's a really cool watch in between there, which is a reference 7922, but with a big crown.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I think this is probably one of the only times that Tudor did this. They actually took some Rolex cases of reference 6538, the Rolex Submariner with the big crown, and inside the case back scratched that out and put 7922. And they were 7922 big crowns. They were never available commercially. They were never sold. They were just delivered to the French Navy. And they were the precursors, the very first big crowns.
Right.
And then if you then jump to 1958 with the big crown, that watch is what inspired the Black Bay 58. That's why it's called Black Bay 58, because it references 1958 of the big crown, the reference 7924. It wasn't until 1961, though, that Tudor became the official suppliers to the Marine Nationale. So whilst they'd been partners and they'd been using the watches, they officially became a supplier in 61.
Okay.
And carried on then until the mid-80s, supplying subs. So there are many 7928 Submariners. Not many, but there are some 7924 big crown watches. The issue with those watches is that they weren't engraved on the case back. Okay. So provenancing those watches is tricky.
Yes.
We know some serial batches and we know roughly what to look for. It was in 1974 when they introduced the Snowflake Submariner, the black 7016. That's when they started engraving the case backs. So that is a much easier watch to appraise and look at. Yeah, but I mean, they carried on issuing those watches till the mid-80s. So it was a long partnership.
Yeah.
And then, of course, fast forward much further to 1921. That's going backwards.
Yeah.
So 2021 with the launch of the FXD.
Of course. Yeah.
Which is, you and I have got a lot of love for that one.
Absolutely, mate. Yeah.
And that was the first time that it was officially used in in advertising. That there was a partnership. There were adverts back in the day. I think there's a famous Big Crown advert that says if it's good enough for the Marine Nationale, it's good enough for you, or something along those lines. Yeah. So I mean, it's a long, illustrious history with them. And now these watches mirror the Snowflake with the caseback engravings. So in the first watches that were launched in 2021 were engraved MN21. Wow. The watches in 22 are MN22 and so on until they decide to retire the line, I guess.
This is why I wanted you on this podcast, mate. This knowledge bank, as I said earlier, is an oracle, oracle of knowledge. That's blown my mind. So that's like the numbers make sense. They correlate. They marry up. Even talking about the Black Bay 58 and going back in time and looking what the influence was behind that. Yeah. That's awesome. That's absolutely awesome.
So if you think of last year's headline release, the Black Bay 54, that's based on the 7922, which first came out in 1954. That was the first Tudor sub. Wow. They didn't get them in the MN for another couple of years, but I guess the reputation was building, and the head of the unit, who was responsible for sourcing kit for the Navy, was aware of them. I'm sure other brands had been tested, but nothing probably quite had the reliability of the Tudor.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you've obviously been involved in researching this brand for a long time, mate. Yeah. How did that start? How did you what was your first Tudor? How did you get into this?
Like a lot of Tudor fans, the introduction really came through Rolex for me. So back in the day, the big place to hang out, where now it's Instagram, the big place to hang out was the Vintage Rolex Forum. Okay. And that was where, interestingly, this is not as acknowledged as I think it should be, but a lot of the knowledge around vintage Rolex was created through the people on the Vintage Rolex Forum. Right. So in the early 2000s, with the advent of watch forums, a lot of the knowledge around chronology of dial types, particularly in Submariners, GMT Masters, Daytonas, a lot of that knowledge was created by a group of guys on the Vintage Rolex Forum, and I was privileged to be part of that group of early scholars, if you like, for want of a better phrase. So I would spend a lot of time on the VRF to the point where I became one of the directors of it. A few years later on, I looked after the market side of the platform.
Okay.
During these visits onto the VRF, there would be these seas of black submariners and chronographs, Daytonas, with their sort of fairly, other than the Paul Newman, fairly conservative dials, Panda, reverse Panda, black subs, maybe, with a faded bezel to give it a different look. But then occasionally these pictures would be punctuated with splashes of colour, a blue submariner, a bright coloured chronograph. And it just caught my eye. And I remember then becoming quite obsessed with these Tudor watches. They looked, to my eye at that point, sometimes they were indistinguishable other than what was on the dial, particularly with the submariners. But it just kind of drew me in, and I started really thinking a lot about Tudor and looking at the watches. And then I started to see the patterns in the watches, and it really just came from there. What there wasn't was knowledge about Tudor.
Okay.
And so that led, there was another guy who was into Tudor, and we became friends, and we, ultimately started this Tudor collector.
Yes.
Thing.
Yes.
I took it forward, and now I would say it's probably the world's leading resource for certainly for vintage Tudor.
Tell us more about this, the Tudor collector side of what you do. How, obviously, you've took us through the inception of it there and how it started. But explain it. What is it? What benefit can someone get from it? What knowledge is there?
It's kind of, I guess, the output of all my thoughts and research, really.
Yeah.
A lot of it is public domain knowledge, but there wasn't a receptacle that held it all.
Of course.
So I don't claim to have invented or have discovered all of this knowledge, but Tudor Collector is a place where it all resides.
Yes.
And where I've been able to make sense of it. Okay. So it has different sections, really. There's a fairly comprehensive section on all the different models, pretty much all the submariners and chronographs anyway. Yeah. And then there's a section where I have written articles. So I in the watch world, I've been a writer for many years, working with different magazines and blogs, and I've always kept Tudor Collector on as kept it updated with
labor of love.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have series like Thrill of the Chase, which talks about amazing finds, different stories of watches that have appeared on the market, sometimes auction summaries, just whatever really, but primarily around trying to create one central resource for vintage Tudor knowledge. Right.
Okay. So that can be used then in many ways. If you're a prospective purchaser of a vintage Tudor, it's a cracking place to go and cross-reference stuff and try and build that knowledge or understanding or further develop.
I would say that, because it's my thing. But I mean, it is useful. And what is always really fascinating to me and humbling is the amount of people that say to me, I love Tudor Collector. I recently did the definitive guide to the big block. So the big block chronograph was launched in 1976. Again, this isn't acknowledged enough, but that for the Wilsdorf House to launch an automatic chrono in 76 under the Tudor name is a big deal because the automatic Daytona didn't come till 1988.
Yeah.
So the group, the stable, the family, however you want to refer to the Wilsdorf group of Rolex and Tudor, chose to get their first self-winding chrono out through Tudor 12 years ahead of Rolex. Those watches to me are really interesting. And again, there's not really a lot of knowledge out there. So I think I published it in December. I did the definitive guide to the big block. And what I always say is the phrase definitive is a bit misleading because it's not finished. Yeah. So already I've had people messaging me with watches that I'd either either forgotten about from the distant past, a variation of a dial that I've been able to add to the article. So I say to people, I'm the custodian of this information.
Yes.
I'm not the owner of it.
Yes.
So let's all share it, and let's make Tudor Collector an actual resource that people can use to help them. And I did an event in December in London with the brand. It was like a collaboration, and there were a lot of VIP clients of retailers there who I presumed would not be that aware of Tudor Collector. I'm quite active on Instagram and have a reasonable following. But what kind of blew me away was how much the modern Tudor buyers were fascinated by Tudor Collector and read all the articles and had that knowledge and used that. Because I think more than any other brand, Tudor really does celebrate their past.
Yeah.
And you see that in the watches. Those early heritage chronographs. I remember in 2010 when they launched the Heritage Chrono out of the blue. Tudor wasn't even available in the UK and the US at that point. They'd pulled them out of the market. They were selling it. Actually, I think now quite interesting watches, but they were a mile away from what they had been even up until the 90s. And they had this interesting 15 years where they were producing watches that didn't really bear any resemblance to the family of Rolex and Tudor.
Yeah.
And I remember, though, Basel World, I was not working in the watch industry then, but I remember the internet blowing up with this watch that had been launched in 2010. And it was announced that Tudor were reviving the brand. Sorry, Rolex were reviving Tudor. And the revival was headlined by this Heritage Chronograph, which was a remake of the home plate, which is one of my favorite watches of all time.
Yeah. This podcast is sponsored by zulualphastraps.com. Zulu Alpha Straps make some of the best watch straps in the market, and we do it all here in the UK by hand. As a listener of the Making Time podcast, you can enjoy 15% off on your next order by using the discount code MakingTime15. Your support makes this podcast possible, so please head over to zulualphastraps.com so we can continue to bring you fresh content. Now, back to the show.
And I remember looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, because the home plate's always been a very, very inaccessible watch, from a financial point of view.
Of course.
And suddenly here was this modern interpretation of it that just was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. And that for me was a very, very exciting moment because Tudor Collector existed. I was, really well into the research. So the fact that the brand suddenly was saying, look, these watches are really cool and they're very relevant for now.
Yeah.
And then in 2012, they launched the first Black Bay, which is, an actual big crown watch that you could buy for a reasonable amount of money and just wear it.
It's a modern interpretation, essentially, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's like, whoa, I can have a big crown and I can wear it on the beach with the kids, making sandcastles and jumping in the waves and stuff. Yeah. So, it became, for me, a brand that was really very, very passionate about its past. And so I think when you get modern Tudor buyers, there's not a disconnect like you may have with other brands. Like, I don't know, the guy that goes and buys a Daytona or a GMT Master or a Sub, which are beautiful watches,
of course,
might not have the appreciation, the passion, or even the interest to look into the history and look into vintage Rolex. I guess the proportion of people that do that is very, very small.
Yes.
What I'd argue with Tudor, just based on my personal experience, is that if somebody's going to buy a Tudor, they've got a fascination and interest possibly in the past. And so a lot of modern Tudor buyers, they're buying a Black Bay and they're told the story of where the Black Bay came from. The Pelagos is a modern snowflake. The Black Bay's got the hybrid of the round hour markers and the snowflakes, but the Pelagos is snowflake hands, square hour markers. It really is a representation of those vintage snowflakes. The chronographs, they don't have them in the catalogue now, but the Monte Carlo, the home plate. So the part of that narrative was, guys, this is a watch that celebrates our past, and that just draws you in. And I think that's where Tudor Collector became a resource for modern watch buyers as well as vintage fans.
Yeah, I agree. I think they attract slightly different crowds.
I think they do.
The Rolex and the Tudor stuff. Yeah, Tudor is rich in its history. It's rich in its heritage. And as you say, the buyer is 9 times out of 10 far more informed on the historical influences that have reached that watch. And I love how Tudor, I'm a big fan of Tudor, mate. I really am, and I have been for a long time. I love how they tell these stories, how they share this journey with you, and bring you on that ride with it. And you almost feel like I put on a Connery strap sometimes, and I'm like, Sean Connery, yes, Mr. Bond. Do you know what I mean? It's that type of vibe.
Yeah, that was good.
Thank you, mate.
That was good.
I've been practicing.
In fact, I think you should do a podcast in that character.
In that, yes.
I'll come on. I'll be the guest for that one because I would love that.
Mate, I've got a deep affinity for Sean Connery anyway. He was in the Navy for a while, and he was an NCO.
Right.
You know, he wasn't commissioned or anything. He was just a regular lad. So I've got a lot of love for that guy. And you know, his private life or his personal life prior to becoming James Bond, but then naturally he became James Bond, and he wore the Connery strap, and now I put a Connery strap on and I'll dress that sometimes. The thing with NATOs or fabric straps or Zulus or whatever phrase you want to use is typically they used to dress down a watch. But I think what Sean Connery's done with that strap is allow you to dress up the watch. Like I would wear that with a tuxedo. I feel amazing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
but
you're right.
That feeling you get from that because you associate it with a certain thing.
Yeah.
Tudor do that exceptionally well when they're telling the story of their watches. So you put this dive watch on, you understand, you know the history and the heritage, and you feel it gives you a feeling.
Yes.
It's more than an object. It's more than, it's not sterile. It's very much engaging, thought-provoking. Yeah. And again, it comes back to emotional investment. You emotionally invest in these, you know, these brands, and that's why you fall in love with them. It's awesome to know, mate, and to see that, you know, the journey you've been on for what now? The best part of what? Okay, we leave that alone. For the best part of a long time.
I mean, it's like early 2000s, really.
20 years?
Yeah.
20 years.
Yeah,
best part of 20 years, mate. I'm sorry.
I don't think of it in decades.
No one wants to think of it in decades.
But you're right. Yeah, I mean, 2002, 3 was kind of the advent of the VRF, Vintage Rolex Forum. So yeah, it is. It's 20 years.
It's awesome, Ross, to have people like you in this game, mate. Because, you know, 20 years ago, essentially what you did was develop a skill set and a knowledge base that not only was shared amongst the community, and I think that was probably the start of the watch community, as it were. Prior to that, they were just individual collectors scattered amongst the place, and we'd sort of meet up and have chats once you figured out someone else was a watch guy. So that internet bit to come along, and not only for you to get involved with that from early doors, but also to have the foresight to gather the information and put it in one place, or, you know, a repository of knowledge, was awesome. What that allows the next generation of people coming into this to do then is have a knowledge bank to refer to. And that makes this so much easier for a lot of people, because essentially you come into this space, you receive the message from the brand. For example, Tudor will say, right, okay, this is what we've made. This is what it's based on from back in the day. Come and have a look at it. That will capture some people's attention naturally, immediately. And they go, wow, I want to know more. Where can I find more? And then they stumble across, you know, this data bank, really, that's been contributed to for a long time by people who understand what the history is and this, that, and the other. And that allows the consumer then to understand, well, I really like this. I really like that. This is probably the route I would like to go in my vintage collecting journey. Or I find an affiliation to this avenue of it. Perhaps you're a marine biologist and you want to look at, the first research watches that because that fits your lifestyle. Perhaps you're a diver, so on and so forth. There's a knowledge bank there that is priceless. in many ways. And as you say, you're a custodian of it, because as the brand grows and as things continue to happen and move and shake and in the way that they do, that will be added to. And it's almost like a people's pot of knowledge, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. It always was the watch for the people, I think.
Yeah.
Tudor. Yeah. It was a very accessible watch. And that maybe explains, I mean, I say this a lot, but I think Rolex was always seen as a high days and holidays watch.
Yeah.
And so seeing unworn, beautiful, new old stock examples appearing at auction of Rolexes is now, it's nice to see, and it's not an everyday thing, but it does happen.
Yeah.
I think with Tudors, people just wore them. Those adverts in the 50s, the trials of destruction, they called it, whereby they, manual steel workers, construction workers, motorbike racers wearing Tudors. I think they were either just disposed of because they really were not a lot of money, even by, generally by watch standards back in the day. And I think people they wore them to death, or when they didn't work, they either got rid of them, put them in a drawer, forgot about them. So it's quite rare to find beautiful new old stock Tudors, I think, because of that. So I think eventually it became the ultimate tool watch in many ways. And now it's very geared to collectors.
Yeah.
I would say, it was always maybe the experimental wing of the family where the group tried things out with Tudor.
Yeah.
I think it's now taken on a life of its own. And actually, I think some of that has informed Rolex. If you look at Rolex's commitment to its heritage has always been quite strong, but it's never really played out in the watches. The watches are always going the next stage and the next step, not looking back in terms of the physicality of the timepiece. But then last year, they surprised everybody with the limited edition Le Mans Daytona. So this watch was made to celebrate, I think, the centenary of the 24-hour of Le Mans, which Rolex has sponsored for many years.
Yeah.
And they produced a watch out of the blue. Instead of having a 12-hour count, it had a 24-hour counter, and the 100 on the bezel was in red. But interestingly, the subdials had designs in that we call the Paul Newman or the exotic dial. Now, Rolex have not done that before.
Okay.
Subsequently, the kind of internet blew up. I think the retail on that watch, it's in white gold. I think the retail's €40,000. So, and it's selling for between 250 and 300,000. So, I mean, the clamour to, I think it's been discontinued. It's not in the catalogue anymore. So it was out there for a few months. That's a very interesting watch for me personally, because it really shows Rolex now going back and looking at watches, because the Newman Daytona's from the 60s.
Of course.
And those square indices on the subdials with the square lollipops. This is something that is a very, very important watch to collectors. The fact that they revisited that in a modern watch, it's a bit like the heritage home plate watch that Tudor did. 14 years ago now. Yeah. And so for me, going back to Tudor, the collection element of it, the collector element of it has always been important. And you can see that in those early watches, even actually maybe up until a few years ago, you bought the watch on either leather or steel bracelet and you got a fabric strap with it.
Yeah.
And they were encouraging you to play and try it on what we would call a NATO strap. But they're hand weaved in France by these centuries old mills, these beautifully made fabric straps. But if you take it back to its essence, it's them saying, yeah, we know you guys like to wear your watches on NATO straps and chain straps. And I think, again, probably Tudor now is there's a vibe, there's a community of people that just love trying them. I mean, this is what you do. This is buying different straps and giving your watch a new look. There's that thing I always see that I don't really use myself, but it's like new shoes on is that like an Instagram thing? Yeah. It's brilliant for me. And the fact that Tudor, they don't just have an eye on it, they openly support it through the strap options. I think now you can buy a watch on either bracelet, rubber, or leather or fabric. But for many years, you got the fabric with it.
Yes.
And that's interesting.
It's interesting, very much so, simply because the wider impact that decision set or that tool watch element has had on the watch industry. as you mentioned there, we've seen Rolex starting to look behind them a little bit now and understand their history and heritage is very powerful, thing to pull from in the design language, etc. But Tudor for me, even we hark back to the Marine National style strap and the story behind that, rather than having just a generic strap that was associated with the watch. The story behind that was so powerful. So I was sat there a number of years ago now, and I heard this story of essentially a bunch of French sailors going, "We haven't got a strap, we'll make one. What we got laying around?" And that kind of inspired me to do my thing. And that's, I thought, well, quite arrogant, how difficult can this be? I learned pretty quick how difficult it is, but
yeah,
you same as anything in life, you persevere, you do your 1,000 hours and you get better at things. But that kind of empowered me as an individual at the time, or a hobbyist, to be like, I think, why not? Why can't I do the same thing? And Tudor have embraced that in many ways and encouraged, as you say, people to make stuff their own and develop character and charm and things around their pieces. It's awesome. And I love the brand, mate. I know you do. You've got a deep affinity for it. And I love how they have become globally now known really as the tool watch. That's, if I had to pick a piece that, it's the end of the world, the zombies are here, or, pick whatever, Hollywood blockbuster, apocalyptic theme you want, probably a Tudor I want on the wrist, simply because they're tried and tested and they've got that heritage and that knowledge base in the brand that just, it's just awesome. It's just awesome. I'm in love with it. And I've said many times, mate, on this podcast, it's the stories. The stories are really important to this. Our phones connected to satellites, cogs and gears on the wrist make no sense. It's 2024, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We emotionally invest in stories. And you'd be hard pressed to find a brand with a bigger or better story than what Tudor have. And that draws so many of us in.
I agree with that.
So many of us in. So on that, mate, I mean, you've touched on the Tudor collector side of stuff. What is the website? 'Cause I know now a bunch of people are listening to this and like, right, where is this, repository of information? How do I access it? Is it tudorcollector.com? That simple.
Just simple.
Simple as that.
And just at Tudor Collector on Insta.
Brilliant. Okay, so guys, yeah, you've heard it here first, head over there. We've touched a bit on there with reference to the Tudor collector stuff, the military history around that brand, helping me and the listener understand some of the nuances in the design language and a bit on Rolex as well. But I think another big part of your experience in this space is writing articles and working with big publications. How and what does that look like for you, mate? I mean,
well, it started when I was. My background is as a musician and in education, and towards my time in education, I was contributing articles primarily on Tudor to Hodinkee, Revolution magazine, which ultimately led to me becoming the Rolex and Tudor editor at Revolution, and then from then I became the editor-in-chief of Revolution UK.
Okay.
I don't do that now, but I still do a lot of freelance writing. So I contribute, again, primarily I write for The Telegraph on their In Time supplement, which is every quarter. And I do all the Tudor copy and a lot of the Rolex copy for that. I write for different magazines, blogs, the general kind of freelance watch writing stuff that there's a lot of us that do.
Of course.
But also my company that I now run has different interests and elements. So I'm the communications director for Monaco Legend Group, which is a Monaco-based watch auction house, which has been great fun.
Wow.
That's co-owned by Davide Parmigiani, who's the world's most important watch dealer, arguably. And so that's great fun working with them on different communication strategies, media outreach, PR, that kind of thing. I'm working on a Web3 project called Alter, which is around tokenization of real world assets. This is something completely new to me. And that's very interesting. That's primarily around the watch and some cars as well. I mean, so for me, it's freelancing in that
Amazing.
Yeah. So the company that I run, whilst Tudor Collector's part of that, part of my passion for watches, it's mainly around media and communications is what I do.
That's awesome. Hey, I've enjoyed your writing for a while. So listeners, please dig out, the articles and the pieces you put together. It's the educational piece I enjoy, mate. And I think there's an element of that where you bring into this space, as you are a professionally trained educator to many levels, how you present information and how you share knowledge is, perhaps you don't intend it this way, but naturally it comes across in a very manageable, comfortable way to consume it, as a reader, even as a listener, on things. So guys, please head over and check Ross's feeds and pages out. Ross, please remind everyone where we can find you online.
So the website's www.tudorcollector.com, and Instagram @TudorCollector.
Superb. Well, mate, thank you very much for your time today. And as Tudor, bring out new things, hopefully we can find an excuse to jump down and sit down again and have another chat, mate.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I'm actually adding a new section to Tudor Collector at the minute.
Okay.
So traditionally, I haven't really talked about new watches, but I feel that because of the synergy between the watches and the past, I think really there needs to be adding to that repository articles on the new watches. So that's something I'm working on at the minute. So I'll build up a back catalogue of what I've written in the past on there, and then moving forward, I'll be covering all the new releases on Tudor Collector as well. So I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be great fun.
I'm excited, mate. And again, Ross, thank you so much, mate. Thanks for taking the time. Guys, thank you. Till next time.